Great. I think we can get started. It is 11 a.m. And this is the FOIA and then the environment panel. Thank you all for joining us today. We're really excited to be having this conversation about, reporting on the public interest on environmental justice issues. First off, my name is Taylor Moore. I'm the moderator of this panel. I'm a freelance journalist in Chicago, and I also work at the International Women's Media Foundation. And I am joined by 4 amazing journalists. I'm going to introduce each of them with their bios, and then we can start off our discussion. So first off, we have Brett Chase, environmental reporter at the Chicago Sun-Times, who reports on environmental protection, pollution, and public health under a grant from the Chicago Community Trust. He is a former investigative reporter for the Better Government Association, and before that worked at Bloomberg News, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and Crane Chicago Business. Thank you, Brett, for joining us here today.
Great to be here.
Monica Ng is a reporter at Axios Chicago. She's a veteran reporter in the city who's worked at the Chicago Sun-Times, the Tribune, and with WBEZ for 35 years before coming to Axios. During that time, she's reported on food, health, culture, and the environment, and she likes filing FOIAs too. Thank you, Monica, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Adam Mahoney is Grist's environmental justice and investigations reporter. At Grist, he has used FOIA to investigate the effectiveness of a federal homelessness program, pollution regulation in Southern California, and how local police departments are, quote unquote, adapting to climate change. Thank you, Adam, for joining us.
Excited to be here.
And lastly, we have Naveena Sadasivam, who is a senior staff writer at Grist covering the environment, energy, and climate change for Grist. She previously covered environmental issues at the Texas Observer, Inside Climate News, and ProPublica. At ProPublica, she was part of a team that reported on the water woes of the West, a project that was a 2016 Pulitzer Prize finalist for national reporting. She is also a Livingston Award finalist and has received awards from the Society of Professional Journalists and the Society of Environmental Journalists for her reporting. Thank you, Naveena, for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Taylor.
So first off, I wanted to ask, just to get a sense of the universe of what can be looked at in the field of environmental reporting. What kind of information can be FOIA'd, and what have you found useful for your own reporting? Anyone can start us off.
I'll just give a quick primer on, EPA is the law of the land when it comes to environmental regulation, but, it delegates a lot of its power to the states. And so like here in Illinois, we have an Illinois EPA, and that's actually, not a bad route to go when you're looking for things like, compliance or, permitting. And I don't know if you understand that, basically these, polluters get a permit to pollute. They have to stay within certain limits, but there's a long process, and you can, you want to get the full record of, especially if it's a controversial factory or what have you, hazardous waste, processing facility or whatever. So you can FOIA the Illinois EPA, and a lot of those records will be there. US EPA. I'm going to, as I said before we started, I'm going to defer to Naveena on how to navigate the US EPA, because it can be a long slog. I've tried to get things expedited, but I like the fact in the state of Illinois you've got a 5-day window before they're supposed to respond to you, and they almost always ask for an extension for another 5 business days. But at least you have them on the clock. And local governments are, they have to follow the same state law. So, in some cities like Chicago, for instance, a big city, it's got its own environmental laws. And we used to have a Department of Environment here, but now it's handled out of the Chicago Department of Public Health. So I send a lot of FOIAs there. Again, they got the 5-day window to get back to you, and then are supposed to respond within 10 days. And I mean, I cover environment really on a daily basis, and so there's been a lot of environmental justice controversies here in Chicago, and those can touch a lot of different areas. Department of Planning, Department of Buildings, Chicago Department of Transportation, Chicago Public Schools, and just be aware that there's a lot of sources to go for to go get some information on environmental issues. So let others talk.
Yeah, I can add to that. I think, like Brett said, if you are covering any sort of polluting entity, right, whether that's a refinery or a petrochemical plant or some sort of like animal feed operation, they're probably regulated by the state. And so you can go to the state, you can go to the city and try to get all of their records, right? And so that includes all the permitting information, but also all of the inspections and enforcement information, which I feel has been, quite helpful in sort of trying to assess, like, is this company in compliance with state environmental rules, right? So I think if you're focusing on certain companies and operators, that's a good route to go. Before you FOIA for that stuff at the EPA's level, go to the local agencies, right? Whether that's the state environmental agency or, if you're dealing with oil and gas, sometimes states have a separate department or a separate agency that deals with oil and gas. So go to them, try to get all of those inspection records. I think the other thing that's been quite fruitful for me personally in my reporting has been trying to get state level and national level enforcement and inspection data. So not only how is one individual facility being inspected, and like how are the laws being enforced, but like sort of taking a statewide or a regional approach to looking at, all right, how is the state choosing to enforce certain environmental laws? And I think what I found, at least in Texas and in Pennsylvania to a certain extent, is that there is sort of a disproportionate way in which those laws are enforced, where in Texas, for instance, some of the big petrochemical refineries, they're emitting tons of pollution, but don't face the same level of scrutiny from the state, whereas small business owners, often that's the folks that they're going after. So you can find sort of patterns within the data, and I found that that's often, like, if you're a state reporter, you're a local reporter, it's helpful to have that data on hand, because you might be doing a story where it's like a 1-line sentence or a 2-line sentence that gives you that sort of like step back, 10,000 foot view. So I found that's helpful. And then the one other thing that I will say is I found it's helpful anytime there's any sort of rulemaking, if there are new rules that the state environmental agency is proposing or the feds are proposing, to try to get staff correspondence around that rulemaking. If nothing else, it'll provide some color into like sort of how the state agency or federal agency, how the staff are talking about these rules and where the pushback is coming from. Or you might find out that it's been highly controversial and there are scientists sort of behind the scenes pushing back about, what threshold they set or how the rules have been designed. So I found that's also really helpful to get.
It's really interesting you say that, because I've gotten some pushback when I've been looking at different rules around lead in the water, and the city said, well, correspondence has discussion about these rules and discussion about draft rules, and drafts are off limit and opinions are off limit. If anybody expresses an opinion, we're redacting it. And I think that's baloney. Well, I mean, obviously the opinion is part of the redaction exemptions, but every single word in the entire email is an opinion. I mean, I'm right now, I'm contesting almost entirely redacted emails I got from Chicago Public Schools. But yeah, I mean, if they do grant you that correspondence around the rulemaking, it's great because it can tell you a lot. But I have had people say, no, people are expressing opinions about drafts of the rule, and so we can't share it with you. I mean, and I think that speaks to sometimes the subjectivity of it. You will have some bodies that are much more forthcoming than others. And the fact that people have brought requests for review to the Attorney General saying, this is baloney, they should not have withheld this information, and then they actually win on that level with a non-binding opinion, but that the Attorney General agrees they should not have withheld that, shows sort of the subjectivity of a lot of this. But what I often look for is information that, frankly, sometimes they should just be handing over without a FOIA. Like, How many lead service line replacements have you done in the low-income equity program? Chicago Department of Water Management. Oh, sorry, you're going to need to FOIA that. Other PIOs might have just handled it right away. I also look at records, of all the houses whose records you've looked at who've had lead problems. What did you find? Give me the full inspection record. When you went there, did they have a lead line? Did they have lead fixtures? How long was their lead line? How old is the house? I remember I had my kids one time entering hundreds of these records in a spreadsheet. But yeah, it depends on your story to know what you'll be looking at. Sometimes you'll be looking through Department of Health, Chicago Public Schools, Department of Water, MWRD. It depends. But public records should be available except for all those exemptions.
Yeah, Brett and Monica both hit on this, but one of the things that I think is best about the environmental beat right now is that it's expanding to encapsulate a lot of different things that weren't historically related to climate change and environmental justice and such. So some of those examples in my own work that I'm looking at right now that I think are pretty big and coming, to national focus over the next couple of months. But one thing is, you can be FOIAing like law enforcement, cops, CPD, for example, for like their climate change adaptation plans, because folks are talking about this. So whether that be like communication records or memos and things like that, that's an easy way to get into this data just so you know what exists really. And then you can build off of that. And another interesting topic is, housing data, because there are a lot of housing programs related to weather adaptation on both the local level, state, and even the federal level. So there's federal agencies that are not typically, associated with being like environmental focused, like HUD or FEMA is, but they both have programs that are giving billions and millions of dollars to cities and states for climate adaptation and housing. And another interesting angle, which is not necessarily Chicago focused, but more nationally leaning, is in the aftermath of like severe weather events or climate events and things like that in relation to housing. Cities keep housing recovery records, or even you can look for like county eviction records, because that's a big thing after climate disasters. So really, I feel like there's a way now to expand what we were looking at as environmental reporters, and that just opens like a whole Pandora box of data from things that you're not, typically thinking of, which is really interesting.
Great. And many of you mentioned or referencing past stories you've done using these records. And I was wondering if each of you could walk me through a time when you had to FOIA documents for a story, and just tell me what you were looking for, what challenges you faced, and then how that information ended up shaping or advancing your story.
I can start. So I do a lot of stories about composting and about Illinois' law that you are not allowed to put organic waste in the landfill. It's been that way since the 90s, I believe. But everyone probably knows that the city does not do a great job of taking all lawn clippings and all leaves and bringing them for composting. But that's just conjecture until you get the data. So I wanted to find out exactly how much yard waste Chicago was bringing to composting facilities and how many calls. So a lot of people don't know. I say it every year, but still people are like, holy cow, I didn't know that. That when you rake leaves or you mow your lawn, you've got to call 311 and say, I have leaves. And I am going to leave them next to my garbage can in any old bag. It does not have to be one of those paper bags. And you need to come and pick them up. And then theoretically, they will pick them up. So I FOIA'd the number of calls they got over the last 10 years, and then the number of tons of yard waste they picked up. And what I found out, after back and forth, we don't have this. These years we didn't keep records. What is the code for the 311 lawn pickup? So back and forth, finally I got them. And what I found was as the number of calls to 311 for yard waste pickup rose, the actual tonnage that the city was picking up and taking to composting facilities went down. And that was, eye-popping. How could that possibly be? You have a 10-fold rise in requests, and then you have a 3-fold drop in actual tonnage. And at the end of the day, the city was like, we don't know why. And that's a story, first of all, that it's happening. And second, the city has no idea why those numbers don't add up. That's not a story you can do in 2 days, because you're going to get a lot of pushback on people even wanting to share the information. Are you saying yard waste, or are you saying, stuff composted in general? I mean, it's just getting the wording right is important, and then figuring out the metrics that you're going to compare is important. But once we finally got it, I did a story for WBZ, and it's the gift that keeps on giving, because every year you just FOIA the same thing to see if they're improving, and they are improving. So that's good.
I'll jump in. You're done, Monica, right? As I said, I cover a number of environmental justice fights here in Chicago, and one of the biggest ones over the last few years has been a proposed metal shredding operation, scrap metal operation, that was being moved from north side, fluent north side, white fluent north side, to the community color down the southeast side. It's called General Iron, and it drew interest from federal government. One investigation that's ongoing is housing and urban development, which is trying to determine whether the city of Chicago is violating the civil rights of its residents under the Fair Housing Act. I'm going to put a link to the story in the comments here. But this was an example of, first I had the tip and a letter from a source that HUD was asking for documents, emails. And this was kind of an interesting exercise, because as part of this federal complaint, this is a complicated story, so it's got a lot of moving pieces. But those community organizations that were complaining to HUD had done their own FOIA, and they had presented a number of emails that dated back to the Manual administration, talking about the process of moving this nuisance, this polluting industry, from the north side to the south side. And I happened to have I had done my own FOIA, and in addition to that, I had somebody else who was interested in it, actually somebody from the north side who had a whole another bucket of FOIA responses. And then in addition to that, there was actually a civil rights lawsuit, and those guys had their own law FOIA. So I had 4 buckets of FOIA responses that I was dipping into. And I bring this up because it's interesting. Some of the things that the federal government was after, the HUD was after, was specific FOIAs that had been pretty badly redacted when it went to the community organizations. And I was able to look through a number of these same FOIAs and see that for some reason they weren't unredacted when it went to another neighbor, when it went to me, and it really helped frame this story. And this is an example of where we're talking about the planning department here, because one important piece of context was this polluter was in affluent Lincoln Park, but it was sort of like the last vestige of an old industrial corridor. And at the time, there was a proposal for a $6 billion real estate development, and the city was hot also to get Amazon's second headquarters, if you guys remember that competition. And it just seemed like it was get this thing out of Lincoln Park at all costs. And that's what these emails. I told you that there's it's almost routine for me to just go get the the permit applications and the comments. That's another interesting thing too, I should mention, is when there's a contentious polluting industry that's looking for a permit, there is a comment period at the state level and also at the city level too. And getting those getting a FOIA in for those comments can be very helpful, because you get all sides commenting and giving some technical expertise and raising concerns or raising the defense for the particular business. So anyway, this was and by the way, this HUD investigation continues, but this was a good example of just how FOIAs of what's going on behind the scenes can be very telling and inform these stories.
I can go next. Yeah, so I spent a lot of last year working on a story about abandoned wells in Texas and New Mexico, right? These are cases where oil and gas operators are, in pretty dire financial straits, and they decide they're just going to walk away from their oil and gas wells, and then it becomes state responsibility to clean up, and that can be really expensive, and so it becomes a taxpayer problem. And during the course of reporting, we realized that a good predictor of whether an operator would abandon their well or not was, the compliance history of that operator, right? So, when there are inspections, are the inspectors finding a lot of violations or not, or do they have a lot of fines? So that seemed to be a good predictor. And so went to the state of New Mexico and asked for, just their inspection history. Give me all of the inspections that you've done for the last 10 years. And I want, in addition to that, I want all of the violations that you've cited against operators. And then further to that, like any enforcement, right? Any fines and so on. And it was interesting kind of comparing with Texas, because Texas has all of this information sort of publicly available. It's on their website. There's no need for a FOIA. I can just hit download and it comes into a CSV and it's great. Whereas in New Mexico, they were relying on this very old data set for it, first of all, where you had to go sort of well by well to pull out the records for each individual well, right? So I'm obviously not going to do that for 50,000 wells. So I filed this FOIA, and within 2 days, I hear back, and they're telling me, one, I'm asking them to create new records, right? That they don't have it in the format that I'm asking for it. And so you're asking me to create new records. And two, this is already publicly available on our website. So go to our website and you can find all of these inspection records on the website, right? And so there's some back and forth, and I try to argue that that's, one, I'm not asking you to create new records because you have this data behind the scenes. I'm asking you to pull it into a spreadsheet. That's not the same as creating new records. And then secondly, also, like, yes, it's publicly available, but you're having me sort of manually click through each well and pull that data out, and that's extremely time consuming and not transparent at all. So there's back and forth, and they keep denying. And at one point, what I had my colleague do, who's a data reporter, is just scrape that data set online, that where they were posting all of the well inspection records. And the information that we got from that, it was a very small data set. It showed that there had been like 10 inspections in all of 2021 or something like that. And so then I could go back to the state and say, hey, I did what you told me to, which is I looked at your public data set and like, is this what you're saying? Are you saying you did 10 inspections? Thinking that would kind of pressure them into handing over the records. And even that did not work. And so at that point, I then filed a complaint with the state attorney general, kind of laying out, all of their reasoning. I knew that the inspectors were taking iPads to the inspection sites, and that they were, typing in inspection records into their iPad. So it is an electronic document, right? It is going into some sort of database. I had all of this information sort of lined up. And so then I could use that to craft this argument to the attorney general, stating that, basically these records are available in some sort of data set. And what I'm asking for is a copy of those records. I'm not asking you to create new records. And so that ultimately worked, because a few months after I filed that request, I then got a massive spreadsheet with every inspection for the last 10 years. And so that was really helpful in the story. So we ultimately got what we wanted, but it was, I think, a whole 6-month process from start to finish.
I worked on a story last year about a federal homelessness program, which was actually born out of just a simple community-focused story that I was working on about unhoused people in the city of Los Angeles, where actually more people die of hypothermia in LA than anywhere else in the country, even though it's 70 degrees all year round. And one of the things that I noticed speaking to organizers around the issue is they were really mad that the city, or they didn't know if the city was using a program that Trump instituted at the beginning of the pandemic that basically reimburses cities and counties and tribes to house unhoused people in hotels to curb the spread of COVID, and also, for vaccines and different things like that. So what I did, which I guess is what we're supposed to do as journalists, it made me start asking questions, and I sent one request to FEMA about the program for like big picture data, which gave me it just gave me how much money was being reimbursed to cities. It didn't give me to which cities or how many programs were enlisted into the, or how many cities were enlisted into the program. So what I did after that, I FOIA'd for everything specifically, state by state, which ended up giving me even more data, obviously, and we were able to create a big picture and illuminate that it wasn't just LA that was like neglecting the program. So it was a way to use FOIA and data to get into, into the weeds a bit from, a policy perspective, but also answering questions that a community had, which I think is really honestly the point of data work and centering human-centered voices and things like that, which kind of gets a little wonky on a national level, but I definitely do think you can bring it down to the community.
Great, thank you all for sharing. A lot of you had brought up a lot of the this scientific or technical data that you were requesting from these agencies, and I'm curious to know when you're trying to when you're writing the story, how do you break all of that information down so that it's accessible to the public who may not be familiar with scientific studies or like the minutia of policy? What are some ways that you've tried to make it more easily digestible so that people can better understand the stakes involved?
Sure, it's a great question. Sometimes when you're doing this research, you can get so caught up in the jargon and the minutia of it that like nobody on the outside, like your spouse, is so tired of hearing about it, and you start using words that nobody else understands. So I'm just like, of course, I'm really worried about the partial lead service line replacement program. And then like nobody calls it that. They say lead pipes or lead tubes or lead water things. And you want to say, well, technically that's not really right, but you also have to communicate. Before I was at Axios, I was at WBEZ for 9 years. And when you're, doing a 45-second news spot that mom has to understand while she's making breakfast or driving kids to school, you have to use very, very clear, short words. In longer narrative pieces, in niche publications, sometimes you can get away with using a lot more technical terms, but at Axios and in the radio, you have to use very clear words and break down very complicated processes into clear words. Like when I used to cover agriculture, it was like, well, they have this permit to discharge nutrients. Discharge nutrients, what does that mean? Oh, that's nutrients. Those are probably good for people, right? And I had to stop using the word nutrient because nutrient sounds good, but nutrient is bad when you have too much phosphorus in the water. And we environmental reporters know that, but you have to think about how the words are going out to the public. So I work with words to try to either in parentheses say what they mean or just break it down to simpler and more understandable terms. Every time I mention compost, I have to say, and you want to compost because, it creates, when you take this organic material and you enclose it, it creates methane, which is, 16 to 60 times more powerful than a greenhouse gas, or you just say it's a powerful greenhouse gas. It's really bad for people. And I hate to say that we're dumbing it down, but I think environmental reporting, again, so many people can feel so hopeless about it and feel like it's so technical that it's our job to try to make it more accessible. And if that means using words that I think they're still accurate, but just are more understandable, that's what we have to do. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think the way that I've got into this, probably because I came into the environmental beat with really no background. I think the best way to do it is through other people's words, because there are organizers and environmental organizations who are, out there working with the same data that we have, and they tend to speak better to community needs and understanding. So like Monica said, a lot of this is very technical. So being on this beat allows us to hammer it down. The fact that we need to put folks' experiences at the forefront. So, while a resident or someone can't necessarily speak to whatever specific policy lingo or scientific data, they can speak to the policy and the data's real life implications, which is just as powerful, just as strong, and honestly gets to the point, at least in my opinion, maybe better than a number can. So it's really about emphasis on what you're highlighting and how you're using these numbers versus how you're using lived experiences, because they go hand in hand, really.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say yes to what Monica and Adam said, and yes, bringing in human voices is super important to the story, obviously, and you can do that through community activists. But also sometimes the researchers who are doing the work can make for great characters and can make for a very compelling narrative, because they're chasing after the truth, and it just lends itself to storytelling. I think that process of finding out information, and you can kind of take the reader along with you. Aside from using people's voices in stories, I think the other thing that's helped me is, especially with large data sets and things like that, really thinking about how to present that information through visualizations. And I work with an amazing data reporter at GRIST, Clayton Aldern, who's a partner on a lot of this. Thinking through how do we want to communicate this giant data set with 200,000 rows of information, right? What is going to sort of stand out to people? I think that is a really powerful tool. So charts, graphs, maps, things like that. And then I would also add, if you're looking through a lot of dense documents or, email correspondence and things like that, I've found taking, sort of snippets of those emails and embedding that in your story also adds a level of sort of intrigue and drama to the story that I think can sort of pull people in, because readers are thinking, oh my gosh, you got emails that staff were sending, that's interesting. And so I think that's another way to also bring people along.
Yeah, I think just I'm really conscious about this. When I'm talking to a bureaucrat or an academic or an advocate, you just have to just keep drilling down. Well, what can we call it? We can't call it even particulate matter is it's a difficult term for people to understand, but soot, and fine soot is I think what I've come to use. And maybe people don't know what manganese is, but you can actually, when I was in Bloomberg, we weren't allowed to use modifiers, but now I can use all the modifiers I want. So brain damaging metal manganese, there's things like that can just help people to realize what we're talking about right away. And then just if you have the the room to explain the harms of a particular pollutant, that's always a good thing. I tend to if it's a whole bunch of different things, somebody just dumped cyanide and arsenic and you name it in Lake Michigan, then you stick with the ones that everybody's going to know, and then and other harmful metals, I think is one way of handling that.
Great. So we do have some questions in the chat that I will run through, and feel free to everyone who's watching can also leave more questions in the chat or the Q&A box. So first question from Siri Chulukuri: what types of documents can you FOIA from utilities?
Well, a public utility, it would be fair game. If it's if it's ComEd or something like that, you're going to have to go to their regulator. But there's everybody is regulated. We have 6 nuclear power plants here in Illinois, and they're regulated at the federal level and a little bit at the state level. But there's all sorts of places to go for utility information. ICC, the Illinois Commerce Commission is I think the primary overseer there. maybe Monica wants to talk about water department.
Actually, I haven't tried to FOIA utilities. I usually, again, I go to the regulators and hope that there's been some sort of communication there that that I can, you know, if it's communication I'm looking for, if they sent a note to the Department of Water Management, but you know, but then I can check the records of their licenses or any inspections.
I actually just published a story that required me to FOIA a public water utility system in Joliet. And what we were able to do, we couldn't get all the data we wanted, but you could, you know, ask for things like their biggest industrial users. So private companies, you could see how much they're paying the city for water and how much water they're using. You couldn't get it on a household level, but they gave averages. So what an average household was using and what an average household was paying. So I think it is a lot easier to probably get data related to bigger users and private companies, obviously, than individual families and households and things like that.
Great. So Jennifer Thurston asks, do you feel like you can get better results with requests when you ask for any and all documents, or when you submit a focused request asking for a specific set of documents?
It all depends. You know, it's trial and error. Sometimes you wish you'd ask for any and all. Sometimes when you do, that's their number one excuse to say overly burdensome. Sorry, you lose. I was doing a story, which actually can be like a cop climate related story. It was about dibs. It was about how many crimes happen after snowstorms. And I found, you know, tons of crimes. People, you know, slash tires, break windows, cut brake lines. And I had to find that through police reports. But I asked for any and all police reports from 2010 to 2020 that had to do with vehicular damage in the winter. And they said, nope, overly burdensome. I said, okay, I just want it for these 5 years. Nope, overly burdensome. Okay, I just want it for a month after these snowstorms for these 5 years. Nope, overly. And it came down to, I got to request 1 week after 3 snowstorms in all of Chicago history. I was really, really mad because I felt like that doesn't really tell you everything. But by being super specific, they finally coughed up the data. And you know, you can feel like, well, is the public really getting the big picture and the entire picture here? No, but sometimes you just got to go with what they'll give you. And in those 1 little week spaces after each of these big snowstorms, you found dozens and dozens and dozens of police calls every day for people who destroyed someone else's car for taking their spot. And with more heavy precipitation events, we're going to see more dibs, unless the city stops it.
Yeah, like Monica said, it really depends on the story and like what you're going after, I think, for sure. I found just, at this point, if I ask for any and all records and have, you know, a broad time period, it's almost an immediate denial. Like I've not had any success with that lately, I think. So, you know, if you have information that can make it a pretty specific request, then I always start out there. And then you can always file follow-up requests, right? You get that first tranche of documents back and you look through and you say, oh, maybe it seems like there's more here. Then you can go back and kind of ask for more. So if I have enough information where I can draft a specific request, I'll start with something specific and then kind of broaden out from there.
I use that language, but there's no, it's not necessarily an either or. I'm going to actually show an example here. Can I do that? Oh, there we go. Here, I'm replying to Jennifer, but you know, you could say, you know, yeah, any and all, but then, you know, whatever details you have to get, you know, that document that you want. I mean, I just show you an example. I've got the, you know, the permit number, you know, the address of the business that I'm seeking information about. So there's no nuance here. But then I don't know, any and all, I don't know. Is this something I was taught to do and I still do it? You know, it's but yeah, I'd say both. You know, just, you know, you don't want them to leave something out, but you know, do make clear what exactly you're looking for. If you have it, you know, sometimes you just don't have. You're you're on a real fishing expedition.
Yeah, I used to start broad and then go specific. Now I start specific and then go broad. One thing, I say any and all correspondence between Mayor Lori Lightfoot and CPS CEO Pedro Martinez between December 9th and January 9th. And that's actually what I had. They took 3 extensions to give me basically redacted baloney. But what I don't get is so redacted emails and then just like a few emails. Hey, Lori, can you talk? Oh, Mayor. Oh, call me. Blah, blah. Nothing, But they must be using other methods like WhatsApp. And so I asked the mayor's office. I said, I want to know every kind of communication her staff, the mayor uses with her staff. Nothing back. So I bet you they do use WhatsApp because they just found out in DC they were using WhatsApp and they weren't even, and they were encrypting it to the point where it couldn't really be FOIA'd well. So that might be a rich thing to find out if there's stuff beyond what they're giving you when you say any and all correspondence.
Another question and comment from Rory Gilchrist. Adam in his remarks pointed to the fact that the environment beat has today expanded beyond what people narrowly thought of climate even a few years ago. As our climate crisis exacerbates, how can reporters use public records to make those cross comparisons to housing, agriculture, policing, etc., how to make those cross comparisons to climate clearer?
I think that's something that, it depends on your framing as an environmental reporter. So like I focus specifically on environmental justice, which obviously allows me to get into the weeds a little bit more about whatever, various inequalities that are affecting people, whether racially, socially, economically. But really at its core, EJ, at least to me, is about people's access to all the things that they need to survive. So food, water, air, shelter, whatever that is, which allows you to be expansive, right? And take a broader perspective on how these inequalities or inequities are shaping people's access to their environment and their daily lives. So like I said before, and I think it's becoming a lot easier to make those connections because agencies and elected officials have taken up the rhetoric around climate justice in EJ, but things like, police departments are adapting, like I said before, or the building we've done at GRIS, we've done a couple of stories about the building of new jails and things like that. So in building of new jails in frontline environmental justice communities, for example, Cook County jails in Little Village, which we all know is one of the biggest frontline communities in the country. But I think there's a lot of different ways to frame these things as environmental justice now, particularly in the coming years. So, mental health services, like in Chicago, under Mayor Rahm Emanuel, the closing of all those mental health facilities, like that's an environmental justice story to me, right? Because you have communities that are facing environmental trauma and every day that don't have access to anything to alleviate that, or access to accessible education and things like that. So like I said, I really do think it's more of an issue based on how you frame your environmental reporting. And a lot of different newsrooms now have people who are specifically focused on climate and someone who's specifically focused on environmental justice. So their stories are going to look a lot different. And I think newsrooms need both, really.
Michelle A. asks, when a municipality has its own local rules, how would one work around those local improprieties? Michelle A., would you be able to clarify what you mean by local impropriety? In the meantime, we can answer a question from Yana Kalmika, who asks, does anyone have ideas on if there's an agency that can provide a regulator workaround for a private water company?
I guess I'm not clear on what that means.
Yeah, Yana, would you be able to clarify in the chat? In the meantime, I'm also curious, what are the most common types of excuses requests for extensions and denials you get from public agencies, and how you try to work around that?
Well, I mean, it's always, they do a cut and paste. Here's why we're asking, we can ask if it requires some redaction, if it requires, looking in the vault for files. But I feel like at 1 minute after I file any FOIA, they immediately say, we need an extension. Even if it's data that I'm just updating. Hi, remember that data set you gave me a week ago? I just need you to cut and paste the new Excel sheet. Oh, sorry, we need 5 extra days. And, I hope everybody out there knows that you only have to grant them 5 days, and you are granting it to them. So I always do this long dramatic thing. Well, I suppose I will grant you this one extension, but by law it's only one, so you better give it to me. And then it doesn't stop them from asking for more extensions. And they know that I'm not going to go running to AG's office, because probably by the time that's sorted out, they'll have gotten it to me. But technically, in Illinois, you only have to grant them one extension. But that's usually, I usually get that, or unduly burdensome. I don't know about the rest of the folks.
Yeah, unduly burdensome is a big one. And at that point, I will try to call the PIO and say, all right, how can I help you? And, Monica was saying something about this a little while earlier, but, often people will say, try to be friends with your PIO. And it's difficult, right? Because you don't know if your PIO is actually trying to, get around handing anything over to you. So I feel like it's a tricky balance at that point. You try and sort of feel out whether this PIO wants to work with you. And I often start out by saying, I want to make this easy for you guys. What can I do to make it easy for you? And so saying things like that, often they'll tell me, all right, if you can narrow it down to 2 months instead of 1 year, maybe we can get you stuff sooner rather than later. And I think to myself, all right, we'll get the 2 months, and then I'll go back for the remaining 10 months. I'll file a second request for that afterwards. So I think overly burdensome is one, for sure, because I request a lot of data sets. We can't create new records is very, very common. And so at that point, I feel like I'm having to go back and forth, sort of trying to explain that because you have this massive data set, asking for a portion of it is not you creating a new record. Or you can just hand over the entire data set if you want, and I can pull out the stuff that I want for my work. And so I think that's another very common excuse, I think.
I'd written down some little tips here, and you guys jog my memory that an overly burdensome is one I've historically gotten a lot of. I probably think of. That's probably the biggest excuse. So you might want to think about breaking up your requests, even before you get to that point. For data, for instance, and then if it's emails, if you're really looking for a large body of emails, you might go the route of asking for an index of subject lines, and that can usually be done pretty quickly. And then if you do get that overly burdensome ruling, you call the FOIA officer, immediately. Say, okay, what are we going to do here? And what will you not deem overly burdensome? And once you have that, one thing I do, because I've been caught in this trap before, is that I submit a brand new FOIA. So they're on the clock for 5 days. The FOIA officer said, okay, we can do it. Worst case scenario is it's the 10 business days or whatever. But you never want to get into the thing where they're off the clock and they've got weeks, if not months, to do your renegotiated FOIA. So that's just my 2 cents on that one.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Follow-up question.
Speaking to that, having the phone number of the FOIA officer really helps. I've had some where I couldn't reach them, they wouldn't answer their email, and I could not find a phone for them. So, but yeah, if you can get it and you can actually talk to a human being, that helps.
I was just going to ask Brett real quick about the subject lines, because that's something that I hadn't heard before, and I think that's super interesting. When they respond to that, do they send you just the subject lines, or does it show up as an Excel sheet or a PDF, or how do they?
It's Excel sheet, yeah. So I just did this with an official. So I had the official's email, and I wanted I put it, I don't know, half a dozen or so keywords. I gave some dates, and as I suspected, there were a lot of hits. I got 5,000 hits, but now I'm going through those to see the interesting subject lines. in my last job, I was at this nonprofit newsroom in Chicago, and my very last story was largely written on the subject lines, actually, because we were trying to. There was this disaster in Little Village where this old coal power plant, 400-foot chimney comes down, coats the entire community in dust. Environmental justice community, by the way, and there's just no accountability at City Hall, and we were just trying to figure out, who knew what when. This Easter weekend, 2020, and we did the same thing. We actually, in that case, we actually went through the city's AIS. It's Assets Information Services. It used to be called Fleet and Facility Management. And, it's interesting. It was an interesting in that FOIA. I recall we were just looking for anybody with a City of Chicago email address. We got thousands and thousands of hits back, but it allowed us to sort of both see what was going on leading up to this disaster, and then the cover your ass pieces of it afterwards.
That's a great tip. I got to remember that subject lines.
Can I ask, so that FOIA was, we'd like to see anybody with the cityofchicago.gov email address that has this particular subject line, or did you get the subject line and reverse engineer it from there?
So yeah, we did keywords and for that one, just the cityofchicago.org, at, any emails, at, so it included, MLL, the mayor, and, everybody else. So the one I just did, and I'm still working on, I took one public official and put that person's name, with a number of keywords on a story that I'm interested in.
I always love FOIAing, how many times they're mentioning that pain in the ass reporter, Monica Ang. That's sometimes that leads to stories because you know what they're hiding, but boy, you usually don't find many compliments about yourself in those.
For requesting emails, I also want to note, because I've also requested those before, that you can also ask them to note if there are any who's CC'd and BCC'd on those emails, and what are the names of the attachments on the emails. So I just note that in any request. So we were actually out of time. So I just want to thank all of you for joining us today and hearing more from our speakers about how to use FOIA in reporting on the environment. So just to wrap up, could we just go around and tell folks where they can find you online?
Sure, I'm at monica.ang@axios.com. And sorry, Michelle, if we didn't get to your thing. So these local municipalities should have to follow Illinois FOIA law, though, when it comes to disclosing.
So I can be found at on Twitter at Brett Chase or bchase@suntimes.com. It's probably the best way is to. I'm on Signal too, but you have to have my phone number. So
My email is nsadasivam@grist.org, and you can find me on Twitter at Naveena Sadasivam.
My email is Mahoney@grist.org, and my Twitter is it's at Adam L. Mahoney. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a good rest of the day, and take a look at the other panels that are happening today and tomorrow.
Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.